Fascinating guest. Today we have a very fascinating guest. It's going to give us an insight into the Underworld, behind the scenes of the NCA's new podcast series launched, with the lead on some of the most notorious crimes solved by a national crime agency over the last decade. Ellie Flynn, investigative journalist and presenter of the Underworld, behind the scenes of the NCA. Welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Hiya, thanks for having me.
So can you tell us a bit more about the podcast, Ellie?
Yeah, so the NCA is inviting the public to hear about some of its most high-profile cases with this podcast, and it's going to be giving us an insight into the work that goes into policing some of the most serious and organised crime. And the work that goes into taking out people at the very, very top of the biggest criminal gangs that we see in the UK. So the first episodes released will reveal how some of the UK's most notorious criminals were captured and put behind bars. So that includes drug smuggler Robert Dawes, a prolific paedophile Matthew Fulder, and weapon trafficker Harry Schilling.
Now, it sounds like a really fascinating series, Ellie. Can you tell us a little bit about the National Crime Agency? What just for our listeners, like what they are, what they do?
Yeah, so the National Crime Agency works to disrupt and prevent serious and organised crime and take out criminals at the very top of the UK's most ruthless gangs.
And just like for our listeners, a bit of an insight into, I mean, you mentioned some of the notorious people involved there, but in the series itself, I mean, what sort of type of people, I'm guessing there's a range of different type of people that you interview, but what sort of type of people, what sort of range of people do you interview for the series, like professionals?
Yeah, so we speak with the specialists and the officers who worked on the ground trying to bring these people to justice. We also hear from psychologists, agencies across the world that collaborate with the NCA in policing some of these crimes. And we also hear about the impact of some of these crimes on the victims.
Yeah, it sounds like a really fascinating show, that's for sure. I think I'll definitely tune in myself. It sounds like really, really interesting, really. And in terms of your own experience, sort of with the show, how did you find it yourself? I mean, obviously, sort of you've got a lot of experience in investigative journalism and the Underworld, like in terms of your experience. But how did you sort of find the experience yourself? Was it sort of eye-opener for yourself, or?
Yeah, it definitely opened my eyes. I think particularly into kind of like the impact and the scale of serious and organised crime, and kind of how much work goes into policing that kind of crime in particular. I think, it was probably the most uncomfortable episode to record, but I think the rap sheet from hell really, really stuck with me. And that's a case of awful child sexual abuse by a really prolific paedophile, Matthew Fulder. And hearing about how the victims came forward and how their courage meant that others who might have been harmed in the future were protected. It just made me feel sort of incredibly proud of them.
No, that's absolutely. No, sounds really like interesting. And in terms of the for our listeners, would you be able to sort of signpost them in terms of like when the show comes out, when the program comes out, the series comes out, and also sort of like what would you say? I mean, what do you think from your perspective was one of the most? What do you think they might find as most fascinating? There's a lot of angles, really. I think it's really interesting. But what sort of one area that you sort of find most captivating?
Yeah, definitely. I think getting a real insight into particularly the covert operations and kind of how much undercover work goes into policing this kind of serious organised crime, I think people will find really, really fascinating, and it's the kind of thing that you don't really hear about that often, understandably, but I think that this gives us a real good insight into how that works. And yeah, you can find the podcast on any major podcast streaming service. That includes Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Google, Deezer and SoundCloud, and you can also head over to the NCA's website or social channels to find out when future episodes will be available.
Yeah, no, it's just really interesting stuff. I'll definitely check it out myself. It sounds really, really fascinating. And it just covers, from what I can see here, just a broad, spectrum of different sort of crimes. And it'll be, and obviously interviewing, a wide variety of different people involved in sort of bringing people to justice in those various areas. So I think it's quite fascinating. So I really want to thank you for your time, and I'll definitely look out for the show. Thanks very much, Ta.
Thanks.